Thanks so much for joining us at C3 Silicon Valley for our podcast. We're currently in our series called Going Public, where we're learning how to dare from a deeper level. We're so excited for today's message, and we hope you enjoy it.
Hey, welcome to Easter. Happy Easter, everybody. Give me some love. You know, it's sad when you have to ask for it, but you know, I'm sure you found a seat, hopefully okay. If you need a seat, you can find one now, but I'm so glad you are here. You know, we have been in the midst of a series at the moment in our church called Going Public. How many people have been a part of this series? You've enjoyed this series. We've had a blast. In this series, we've really been kind of learning how to be daring from a deeper level. What that means is we've learned how to find victory in vulnerability. Bizarre concept, I know, but what we've been learning is that there is actually strength in vulnerability. That those who are truly confident in life are those who are truly willing to be vulnerable in life. And I know, I've seen your Instagrams. I know that many of you are daring in the vulnerability area. I know you're getting more and more vulnerable. I know it's empowering for you. I know Donald has. Donald is not salsa dancing in secret anymore. He's gone public. But I thought it would be a great platform, being Easter Sunday, to use this platform to really kind of go public in a way and in more than one way be vulnerable with you. And it may not help you, but it will help me, like my own private therapy session, where I can just be vulnerable about something that I've been wanting to kind of get off my chest and put out there, but was really difficult in a one-on-one conversation. Are you ready for it? Yeah. I thought it'd be great just to, in the spirit of vulnerability, to let you know that I have watched an entire season of The Bachelor. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh yeah, like, you know, you want to be a supporting husband. You want to watch it for your wife. No, I got caught up in the love triangles. Couldn't help it. That feels better. It's out there now. Feels better. But it's fascinating to me, you know, we would watch it, and man, at first I was just the supporting husband. I thought, you know, I'll help my wife, we'll sit there together, and then I'm like, oh, he didn't. No. Oh, that poor thing. And some nights I'd be like so looking forward to it, but I didn't want to come off like I was super pumped about it. Anybody know what I'm talking about? And I'd be like, hey, honey, like, do you want to just like unwind? Maybe we just watch a bit of TV before we go to bed. And she'd be like, you got anything in mind? I'm thinking, well, I mean, we've got the chocolate, we've got the wine. Maybe it's bachelor time. You know, I'm like, come on. But another series that I found recently was the series Fixer Upper. Anybody know that series? Now all the men come out. Yeah, I know that one. Yeah. Well, I know it's not a new series, but it's new to me. And don't worry, I binge watched 3 seasons and I'm up to date. I am fascinated by this show. I love watching what Chip and Joanna Gaines can do in Waco, Texas, as they take houses. And I don't know what's more impressive to me, the fact that they can take a house that I don't even want to walk in and transform it to a house that I really want to buy now. Or it's the fact that they can buy a 4-bedroom house for $134,000 all-in budget. That's not reality. Is that real? In the Silicon Valley, that won't even buy an annual parking space. But nonetheless, I love it. And every time I watch it, I'm fascinated at the fact that they can take a house. And every time I look at the house, I'm like, no way. I'm like, no way, there's nothing they can do with this house. I feel like I have some experience in this because in my first ministry position, and this sounds funny saying that because really that sounds formal. It was just the first place that would pay me to preach, and that was it. That was how it worked. Oh, someone can talk? All right, you get the job. And I remember next to our church, they had this old cement factory. And it was like done. It was out of business for a long time, and it closed down, and they were going to destroy the factory, and they're going to level it and build something on it. And I remember it was a wooden factory, and they'd torn down all this lumber, and they were just burning it. Like, that's what they do in Australia. I know here you're worried about the environment. Australia, we don't care. There's a hole over the ozone already, and we don't care anymore. It's done. And so they're just burning this wood, and it was like burning for 3 days. And a buddy of mine said, oh man, you know they're burning premium hardwood. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, it looks gray, it looked disgusting. And he's like, no, trust me, because it's burning so long, I know it's good. And so we went and helped them out by taking some of that wood. We helped them because they're going to burn it anyway, amen. If it helps your conscience, they let us, okay? Just settle down, everybody. And I remember we took it to his factory and we put it through the machine, and it went in all gray and disgusting, and what came out the other side was this deep red, delicious wood. I'm telling you, this stuff was sexy. It was so nice. And we made some money off this stuff. And I'm like fascinated, because I remember first up going, no way. And I feel like that's what I do when I watch Fixer Upper. I'm like, look at this going, no way. But they always transform it. Every time, Chip and Joanna, they get it every single time. And it got me thinking, I wonder if this is how we look at our own life. I wonder if we see ourselves like a fixer-upper, where we can look at the condition of our lives, we look at our history, our past, our problems even, and we kind of think, no way. There's no way. No way, God, I don't know what you could do with this mess. You know, I was wondering this, and I thought this would be a good question to ask this Easter. This is a very significant event in history. It's a very significant time in mankind, and we're celebrating that significance. But I thought the question that would be good to ask this Easter is, what significance does it hold for me? And I thought we could do it from a different perspective today. I thought that we could kind of take a different perspective, and we could look at it from almost like a before and after kind of approach, because we've got the cross, which is a pivotal moment for mankind. On the other side of the cross, we've got the resurrection, which is the power of Jesus. The fact that he died and the fact that he rose again is where the power is. But maybe we could look at a before picture, which we find before the cross, a very private conversation. The cross was Jesus' most public moment. But before his most public moment was a private conversation. And maybe that private conversation could hold some purpose for us today. And I thought we could set the scene where we could look at the private conversation known as the Last Supper. And I don't know if you know the story of the Last Supper. Maybe you've just seen the famous picture of the Last Supper. But I thought that we could put ourselves in the scene today. You excited about that? I am. I thought that we could just kind of enter the scene a little bit. Maybe look at it from a different perspective, because in Luke chapter 22, you can turn there if you've got a Bible. If you don't have a Bible, we'll put it up on the screen for you. In Luke chapter 22, we get the Last Supper scene. Luke chapter 22 and verse 7, it says this: "Now the festival of unleavened bread arrived when the Passover lamb is sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John ahead and said, 'Go and prepare the Passover meal so we can eat it together.' 'Where do you want us to prepare it?' they asked him." Because, you know, the disciples and Jesus, they didn't really have a base of operations. They would just travel around from town to town, ministering, healing people wherever the need was. They would go wherever they got ran out of the city. They'd just go to the next city, and they were just ministering around the place. Jesus replied, "As soon as you enter Jerusalem, a man carrying a pitcher of water will meet you. Follow him. At the house he enters, say to the owner, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover meal with my disciples?' He will take you upstairs to a large room that is already set up. That is where you should prepare our meal." They went off to the city and found everything just as Jesus had said, and they prepared the Passover meal there. What you need to understand, in order to really understand and get the picture of what this is talking about, you need to know a little Bible history. Because we know this scene as the Last Supper. But the disciples didn't know this as the Last Supper. They didn't know this was the last anything. They knew this as the Passover meal. And really, to get a perspective on the Passover meal, we first need to know just a little bit of Bible history. And I don't know if you know the story of Moses. Maybe you've seen the movie. I don't know. But in Exodus, we see a story of Moses, where God speaks to Moses and says, "Moses, I want to bring my people out of captivity." His people, he'd heard the cries of his people. He'd seen the anguish that his people were in under the care of Pharaoh in Egypt. And he'd called Moses to be his spokesperson to say, "I want you to set my people free." But Pharaoh wasn't a part of that plan. In fact, Pharaoh wasn't down with this. He was not interested in losing his entire labor force just because some crazy guy came out of the desert and said, "Let my people go." And so we see the story in a show of God's power and a little display of God's power. He sends several different plagues. How many people know the story? You've seen the cartoon. You see different plagues and some frogs and some locusts and different things like that. But still, Pharaoh is not on board with this picture. And so what God does is he says to Moses, "I'm going to send my spirit, and each firstborn son in Egypt will die unless you have sacrificed a lamb and you paint the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, in that case, my spirit will pass over that house. And that is why they celebrated the Passover. Because that day, God saved his people. That was the catalyst. That was the moment where things shifted and the people were set free from Pharaoh's rule. And I love this story because ultimately you understand what Jesus and the disciples, the Israelite nation for centuries had been celebrating the Passover meal. Remembering that time that God set the people free. And Jesus chooses this meal, this moment. The disciples don't know he's about to go to the cross. Jesus kept alluding to the fact that his time was coming, but they didn't know that. And so he chooses this meal, the Passover meal, to be the statement that you've been celebrating for centuries, a meal where God saved the firstborn. But I'm coming as the ultimate sacrificial lamb. My blood will be slain. I'll be slain. My blood will be shed for not just the firstborn sons, but for all mankind. I will save everybody. And so he shares this meal for them known as the Passover meal. And he goes on to say this in verse 14. It says, when the time came, Jesus and the apostles sat down together at the table. Everyone say the table. At the table. And Jesus said, I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. For I tell you now that I won't eat this meal again until its meaning is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. Then he said, take this and share it among yourselves. For I will not drink wine again until the kingdom of God has come. He took some bread and he gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, this is my body which is given for you. Do this to remember me. Do this to remember me. You know, Jesus, he made a command. He said, do this. I thought that we could make this an interactive sermon today. I thought we could have a 4D Easter. Wasn't just sight and sound and touch. Maybe we could go to taste. How many people think we should do what Jesus said? We should have communion together. Why don't you pass out communion this morning at both locations? Because I find it an interesting interaction, if I'm real honest with you. Because in the midst of this interaction, Jesus he's breaking bread. He's using bread and wine as elements to represent a significant moment in history where Jesus will go to the cross. But you've got to understand the context of when Jesus is having this meal, because the cross hasn't happened yet. Yet he's talking as if it's past tense. He's talking, do this to remember me. This is my body that was given to you. This is my blood that was shed for you. And so you can kind of forgive the disciples for not really figuring out the gravity of the moment. That they're kind of like, okay, God, I'm going with the plan, Jesus. Jesus has alluded to the fact that he's going to suffer, that his suffering will begin shortly. So they're aware that Jesus is talking about something, but maybe it's metaphorical. They don't know yet. Because they put all their hopes, all their dreams in Jesus. And now he's alluding to the fact that do this in remembrance of me. They're like, what are you talking about, Jesus? And to really understand that there is another passage in the Bible that will help us. See, there's a story where Jesus and his disciples were ministering one day. And as they're ministering, word comes to him, Jesus, your friend Lazarus is sick. Lazarus was a real dear friend of Jesus, and Jesus gets the report, but instead of responding immediately, he continues to minister in that place for another 3 days. A couple days later, he goes to see his friend Lazarus, and when he arrives there, Martha comes up and says, it's too late, Lazarus is dead. And she's upset. I mean, she's upset at the fact that her friend Lazarus is dead, but she's really upset with Jesus because Jesus held the power to change the situation. And he says to Martha, he says, Martha, don't you believe that he will rise again? And Martha's like, oh yes, Lord, I do believe that in the end of days all men will rise. Yes, Lord. But Jesus, he responds with saying, Martha, but I am the resurrection and the life. In other words, when you feel the magnitude of that statement and you understand the magnitude of that statement, resurrection isn't an event. Resurrection is a person, and that person is Jesus Christ. So whatever Jesus touches has to come to life. Whatever Jesus is involved in needs to breathe again. It's not just an event in time, it's who he is. He is resurrection And so around this table, around a table that often can hold so much controversy and intimacy at the same time. Table can indicate so many different things. You know, we see in the scriptures time and time again references to tables, miracles at tables, things that take place around the table. There's fellowship around the table. And I'm always fascinated when we approach the subject of the Last Supper. I mean, these guys have been with Jesus for 3 years. 3 years ministry, and what would you expect from the Last Supper? Sometimes we expect maybe an inspirational speech, maybe the greatest commencement speech of all time. You know, dip your hat, throw it around, you know, like off you go. But it's not really that as much as it's a confrontational speech in many ways. What Jesus gives. And here in this moment, they got the elements. They got the bread, they got the wine. And he says this, he talks about the bread. And after he says this in verse 20, after supper, he took another cup of wine and said, this cup is the new covenant between God and his people. An agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. He's saying, come on, not only am I talking about the resurrection and the life, I'm also talking about a new system that I'm going to implement. A brand new system. And to understand the new covenant, you have to know the old covenant. The old covenant was one of law, one of works, one of my best efforts, and by behavior modification, if I can act right, if I can do right, or at least if I can show that I do right, then I will attain righteousness by my effort. But the problem with that is when you can't act right, and you don't do right, and you don't have what it takes to meet the mark, there's a lot of condemnation that comes with that covenant. And so Jesus says, I'm going to make a brand new covenant. I'm going to make a covenant where it's not by what you can do, but what I have done. Oh my goodness. It's not by your efforts, it's by my grace. And so he says, let this be the marker of a brand new covenant that I'm beginning with my people. So he says, whenever you break the bread, let's take the bread. He says, know that this is my body that's given, not just one time, but continually given. Let's take the bread. And then he says, and this cup, which represents new life, which represents that once and for all lamb. Not just a continual sacrifice, but a once and for all sacrifice. Not just for the firstborn if you put it over the doorpost, but as my blood shed, it covers all sin. That's good news. Let's take the cup. And in the midst of this powerful moment, around a table, in an upper room, prepared for the Passover meal before Jesus goes to the cross, it says here in verse 21, it says, but here at this table, everyone say this table, sitting among us as a friend is the man who will betray me. For it has been determined that the Son of Man must die. But what sorrow awaits the one who betrays him? The disciples, they began to ask each other, which of them would ever do such a thing? Then they began to argue among themselves about who would be the greatest among them. I mean, picture this. How many parents know this scene? How many parents have done their best to set up a situation in your life where you've done your best to kind of be mom of the year or be dad of the year, and it's a birthday party, maybe it's Christmas, maybe it's Thanksgiving, I don't know, and you've set the table, you've set everything nice, you've made sure that all the napkins match and the plates match, and you've been on Pinterest, you've got your Pinterest board, you made it all look good. I mean, you're taking selfies with it, you know what I mean? It's on Instagram, it's on everything because it's like parent moment of the year. And the kids come out and they're like, whoa, Mom, this is amazing. And then it doesn't last for more than 5 seconds before the chaos of your real life breaks out. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? I feel like this is what Jesus is facing right here. He's got a moment where he's talking about the suffering he's about to take on for their sake. But whenever you break bread and whenever you share the wine, do it and remember me. Remember the grace that I've given. Be confident in it. He's having an incredible moment where he even says, and it's a great picture of who Jesus has at the table. He even has those that will betray him at the table. Judas, we know, is about to betray him. Peter is about to deny him. And still he invites him to the table. And then in that moment, they go from, me? Is it me? Who is it? Who is this person? Who would betray him? And all of a sudden, they start breaking out in an argument. And I kind of think it's fascinating. We can look at some other gospels, and like John, for instance, and John begins to share with us and show us from his perspective who was actually at the table and where they were seated. John, in his own gospel, I love this about John, he gives himself a nickname because he's writing about himself in third person, and he calls himself John, the disciple Jesus loved. How's that for confidence? What nickname would you give yourself if you were putting yourself in the Bible? Adam, the mighty and strong one. Adam. But John gives us a picture, and John makes us know that he was sitting on God's right-hand side, on Jesus' right-hand side. He was so close to Jesus that he could even lean on him. And it reveals that Judas, the betrayer, was on his left-hand side, close enough to dip in the same bowl as Jesus. And the other disciples, we know where Peter was. We can assume that Peter must have been across the table. He was always close by, but he still had to be far enough away to indicate to John, hey, motion, John. Ask him, who's the betrayer? And so we don't know the positions of people, but they begin to argue about positions in heaven. It reminds me of another story in the Bible where Jesus had left Jerusalem. He's out ministering, and he goes to a town, and him and his disciples go into a house to eat, trying to do it secretly. And in that house, they're eating a meal, and a woman comes up to Jesus. And this woman approaches Jesus. She wasn't a Jewish woman. She was a Gentile woman, and in those days, Jews and Gentiles definitely did not interact or meet specifically a man and a female. And she comes up to Jesus, knowing who he is, knowing what he can do, and she says she had a sick daughter. The daughter had an evil spirit, and she says, Jesus, would you heal my daughter? And it's a fascinating passage because in that passage, Jesus ignores her. Completely ignores her. And it kind of is fascinating when you read it because it doesn't seem true to Jesus' compassionate nature. And to the point where she keeps arguing so that the disciples have to say to Jesus, Jesus, could you send her away? And then he says this statement which is fairly powerful. He says this, he says, is it right to give the children's food to the dogs? Now, when you read that, you're kind of like, whoa, Jesus, I'm a bit uncomfortable with this. This doesn't show who you really are. But what you've got to understand contextually is that was a common term for anybody who was non-Jewish in those days. Anybody who wasn't a part of God's chosen people, specifically the Canaanites and the Syro-Phoenician woman, these people were seen as dogs. They were referred to as dogs, and many of them took on that condition themselves. And what's powerful in this interaction is what Jesus was trying to ultimately do, not just for her, but also for the disciples, was to reveal to them that so often how we see ourselves is whether we determine whether we're worthy or not to be at the table. Is it based on your worth? Who am I to give the children's food to the dogs? And her response is amazing. She says, yes, Master, but even the dogs are allowed to eat the crumbs from the Master's table. And what's powerful about that, and Jesus responds, your faith is great. Your daughter is healed. Because what's so powerful about that is she realized, you know what, I might be considered a dog. In fact, I might even look at my own life that way. I don't have it all together. I don't have my marriages. I've been through several marriages. I don't know where my husband is even now. And the decisions I've made in life probably don't make me worthy to sit at the table. But even if I came as a dog, dogs even have a place. Even dogs. There's another story. In fact, Jesus, he ate at many tables. Jesus ate at the table of tax collectors. That was scandalous in those days. Jesus ate at the table of notorious sinners. You know it's going to be bad if you're a notorious sinner. But Jesus also was invited to the table of Pharisees, religious leaders. And this one time Jesus was eating, we see it in Luke chapter 14. He's eating at the table of a well-known Pharisee, one of the most known religious leaders in the town, and he invites Jesus to a meal with several other well-known religious leaders. And he watches as they come in, and they're all jostling for position. They're all trying to find the seat of honor, and they're jostling around. And Jesus is watching this jostling going on. He's watching them find and fit and move and squeeze in to get the position of honor. And Jesus says, come on, what are you doing? It's not how it works. And Jesus tells this parable. Right off the back of that, he tells a parable in Luke chapter 14 where he says, a man prepared a great feast and sent out many invitations. When the banquet was ready, he sent his servant to tell the guests, come, the banquet is ready. But they all began to make excuses. One said, I've just bought a field and must inspect it. Please excuse me. Another said, I have just bought 5 pairs of oxen and I need to try them out. Please excuse me. Another said, I now have a wife, so I can't come. How's that excuse? Sorry, got a wife. All you newly marrieds, do not use that excuse. You won't have a wife very long. The servant returned and told his master what they had said. His master was furious and said, go quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and invite the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. After the servant had done this, he reported, there is still room for more. I like what one version of the Bible says. It says there's still room at the table. There's still room at the table. There's still room for more. All those that were first invited, they rejected the invitation. They thought that it's not about the invitation, it's about their own efforts. I'm good on my own, Jesus. I'm good on my own, master of the banquet. You know what? I'll make my own way. I'm going to earn my own righteousness in life. But then he began to invite those that realized they don't have what it takes. They were lame. They were blind. They were brokenhearted. They realized that they got stuff in their life. And then he says this, so he master said, go out into the country lanes and behind the edges and urge anyone. How many people fit in that anyone? I'm an anyone. Invite anyone you find to come so that the house will be full. For none of those I first invited will get even the smallest taste of my banquet. You need to understand what Jesus was referring to was the idea that the Jews were the first invited, that God came to them, but in their rejection of grace, they wanted to stick with the old system. They wanted to stick with the system of the law by their own efforts, by their best efforts. But Jesus was coming with a brand new invitation to a brand new system. And I like what he does. He in one conversation with the disciples, in one moment at a table, just a table in an upper room, a private conversation with those that have seen him minister, those that had seen him work, those that had seen him do healings and do all these different things. In one moment, he turns the tables. He turns the tables on a religious system. Check out what he says to the disciples who were talking about now, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? What's my position going to be, Jesus? What's my position? Am I going to be higher than Peter? Surely I'm going to be higher than Peter. Thomas is even doubting whether he's going to be there or not. I got him licked. And they're fighting about position. And then check what he does to turn the tables. Jesus told them, verse 25, in this world, kings are great and men lord it over their people. Yet they are called friends of the people. But among you, it'll be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. He says this, check it out. He says, who is more important? The one who sits at the table or the one who serves? Well, the one who sits at the table, of course, but not here. Not at this table. Not in my kingdom. He says, for I am among you as one who serves. He was turning the table, friends. He was changing the system. He's talking about a brand new covenant that's no longer about law, no longer about works, no longer about your best efforts to see how far you can get, but he's realizing, come on, let's get to the party and realize I can't do it. I'm like, if I'm real honest, if I'm really vulnerable, I'm like a dog. If you knew my thoughts, if you knew my habits, if you knew my actions, if you knew my past, it's not so squeaky clean, but Jesus is like, but I'm introducing a new system where it's not about what position you have at the table. Be like the woman who was happy with possession of the kingdom. It's not about your position in the kingdom. It's about a possession of the kingdom. Even if I'm under the table, at least I have a place. Even if I'm next to the table, around the table, I don't need to be in the seat of honor, but I know there's just as much power under the table as there is on the table. I know there's just as much power at the table. And it's not about the position. It's about having a possession of the kingdom. It's those that are counted by the invitation of grace. By grace. It's a new system. He turns the tables. Turns the tables on religious ritual. And he says, now it's going to be about right relationship. Check this out, because he goes on to say this in verse 28. He says, you have stayed with me in my time of trial. And just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I now grant you the right to eat and drink at my table in my kingdom. I now grant you the right. And we miss the weight of this statement, because for the disciples, they're learning for the first time that it was never about a right, it was about religious ritual. That's how you got in. That's how you qualified. It was about what you could do, how good you could be, how much you obeyed the letter of the law to the most minute part. How is your performance? But now Jesus is turning it upside down, and he's saying it's not by your performance, it's by my performance. It's not what you can do, it's what I have already done. And he's like, come on, what I'm doing now is I'm opening this as an invitation to say that there is room at the table. There's still room at the table. Even if you've seen yourself as not a qualifier for the table, capability is not a qualifier. What's a qualifier is those who are simply available. Simple availability to say, God, I'm here. Not using your wife as an excuse. But recognizing, I'd love to be at the table. And if it's based on my best efforts, I know I'm not going to make it. That was done a long time ago. That was over, but you're telling me it's not by my works, it's not by religious rituals, it's not even by how much I can pray. It's simply by receiving grace. You know, resurrection isn't an event. It's a person. It's Jesus. I am the resurrection and the life. But what's fascinating to me in all of Scripture, every miracle, everything that Jesus did, every powerful act, every saving thing Jesus did, at no one time did he use the word grace. I mean, it's in the Bible, but Jesus didn't use it. Because grace is not a concept. Grace is a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. So wherever he goes, he doesn't need to say grace. He is grace. Even when he was with the Pharisees, he was showing grace. Grace enough to challenge them in the areas that they're missing the mark and using the old system and not coming to the new system. He was grace to the woman. He was grace to the hurting. He was grace to the lost. He was grace to the lame. He was grace. Wherever Jesus was, there was grace. And I got to tell you here today, Jesus is grace for you. It's grace. I love what Paul says, it's grace on grace. It's not grace just for the start of the relationship with him, it's grace every single step of the relationship with him. Meaning that I'm sure even though I step into that relationship and I receive grace, I guarantee you tomorrow I'm going to stuff up again, but it's grace on grace. That grace keeps going. That grace keeps meeting me at every single step. Wherever I find myself, God's like, this is the new system. Would you come to the table? Don't worry about your position. Don't worry whether you think you just only deserve under the table. Don't worry about where you think you're going to sit at the table. Just find a place, because there's room at the table. There's room at the table. Look at your neighbor, say, there's room at the table. There's room for you at the table. Find your other neighbor and tell them there's room for you too at the table. Come on, some of you aren't looking around like you're too good for this message, but you need to look around today and you need to look your neighbor in the eye, get a little uncomfortable and say, there's room for you too. Come on, there's room for you too. There's room for you too.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. For more information about C3 Silicon Valley, to plan your visit, or to support this ministry financially, visit us at c3sv.com.